I wonder if they knew at the time that this wild experiment with 4 helicopters and one outrageous idea would change the course of history forever. Today we're talking about the stuff that dreams are made of, helicopters and gunpowder. Separately, they're already amazing, but when you mix them together, you either get military innovation or a recipe for something that skirts the line into war crime territory. Either way, America has a long and proud history of aviation success stories, and in typical American fashion, we found a way to weaponize that too. It didn't take long to realize that you could use the skies above to unleash hate down below. Concepts like shoving troops out of a perfectly functional aircraft, using heavy bombers to reshape the landscape, and even modern emotional support machines like the Apache, AC-130, and the A-10 Warthog are all examples of how America likes to show that sharing truly is caring. But despite all that firepower and freedom enforcement, there is one airframe that never gets the praise it truly deserves for its contributions to aerial homicide enabling technology. I am of course talking about the criminally underrated flying trash can, aka the CH-47 Chinook. The CH-47 Chinook is a workhorse, no doubt about it. But in the 1960s, someone who I can only assume was fueled by equal parts caffeine and chaos looked at this shiny new, at the time, cargo chopper and thought to themselves, you know what this thing needs?
Guns. Lots of guns.
You know, if an idea like this was proposed today, you'd have an entire committee debating whether or not this was a little too much. But back then, during the wild days of Project MK Ultra, I'm sure anything seemed possible. Ooh, sir, I have an idea. Let's shoot a nuke out of a rifle and mount it to a Jeep. The boys are gonna love it. Oh man. See what I mean? Anyway, what came out of this demand for a more effective aerial freedom spreader was the Guns A Go-Go program, a mad science experiment to see what would happen if you turned a heavy lift helicopter into a flying arsenal. The ACH-47 Alpha Chinook, lovingly nicknamed the Go-Go Bird, didn't just support troops, it owned the battlefield. This is the story of how a short-lived experimental airborne fortress proved just how effective an over-the-top firepower solution could really be. This thing was living, breathing proof that sometimes the answer truly is, just add more guns. That said, the sad reality is this program didn't last long, but its impact to this day is undeniable. The lessons learned from this short-lived experiment helped to directly shape the tactics, techniques, and weapon systems for the AH-1 Cobra and, for that matter, every single gunship that followed. So now, anytime you see an Apache overhead, a Viper, the Little Bird, or the DAP forcibly injecting itself into one's personal space at 3,000 rounds per minute, you can nod in approval knowing that they owe it all to the ridiculous overarmed Chinook that paved the way. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1960s, counterculture is going mainstream, the CIA is up to its usual antics, and America finds itself knee-deep in a war that nobody wanted. It was in these dense, humid jungles that the concept of air-mobile cavalry, helicopter-mounted infantry, truly came into its own. Vietnam became the proving ground for this revolutionary idea, and like any groundbreaking shift in warfare, it came with plenty of trial and error. One of the more persistent challenges was using the UH-1 Huey as a gunship. Now, before some self-proclaimed Vietnam historian lights up the comment section, just hear me out for a second, will you? Now, I'm not taking away from the fact that the Huey was a game changer for its time. It really was. It revolutionized troop transport, medevac operations, and close air support. But as a dedicated gunship, it wasn't exactly a perfect fit. Sure, it was great for light fire support, but physics doesn't care about your intentions. Slap too many guns on a small aircraft not designed for the extra weight, and what you end up with is something that is too slow to keep up and barely effective when it arrives. What the Army needed was something bigger, faster, and a whole hell of a lot meaner. Several helicopter models were considered, but the Chinook was the clear winner for a few simple reasons. Because it was already in production, spare parts were readily available. And because it could carry more weight than a politician's ego, well, that made it the perfect platform to pimp. By 1965, the Army authorized production of 4 armed CH-47 prototype configurations, and the development of the Chinook as a dedicated aerial weapons platform kicked off soon after. These helicopters weren't just renamed. They were reimagined, branded with a heavy-hitting mission, and given a whole new designation, ACH-47 Alpha, or Attack Cargo Helicopter Model A. The first prototype, nicknamed Cost of Living, rolled off the line in July 1965, and by November it had completed its first flight, with the next step being to put these hovering fortresses through their paces. Initial testing took place in Aberdeen, Maryland, under the Army test boards, before the aircraft moved to Fort Benning, Georgia for more intensive training. Following hot on the heels of Cost of Living, 3 more 47 Alphas were built, which included the call sign Stump Jumper, Easy Money, and my personal favorite, Birth Control. By mid-1966, 3 of the 4 prototypes were shipped off to Vietnam. Their job would be to escort troop transports, clear landing zones, and to remind the enemy that some problems can only be solved with overwhelming firepower. The performance of these aircraft earned high praise, with officers comparing the ACH-47 Alpha to the Air Force's own C-47, also known as Puff the Magic Dragon. But as we'll soon see, the Go-Go birds weren't just good, they were also paving the way for a whole new era of airborne destruction. If you haven't noticed by now, there was a lot of hype surrounding the Go-Go bird, and for pretty good reason. After all, it did have a pretty important mission to accomplish. But what made this flying fortress so special? Well, that's an easy one, because it wasn't just about the amount of firepower this thing could deliver, but it was about how efficiently it shared its chaos. Pound for pound, the ACH-47 Alpha could sling more hate than anything else the US has ever fielded, and when I say ever, I mean ever. Yep, here we go. Cue the internet skeptics.
Shut up!
Are you freaking kidding me? You have got to be the dumbest, most smooth-brained individual I've ever come across in my life. Are you seriously gonna sit there and tell me that the Go-Go bird carried more firepower than the AC-130, B-52, and the B-1 Lancer?
No, that's not what I said.
Man, I swear for the life of me, I feel like I'm talking to your wife right now because you didn't hear a word I just said. I didn't say the Go-Go bird could carry more ammo than those Titans of Terror. What I said was, pound for pound, the Go-Go bird wins. Think about it like this, it's kind of like the difference between motorcycles versus cars. A sport bike doesn't beat a Lambo because it's outright more powerful. It's all about power to weight ratio. The ACH-47 Alpha was insane, with nearly half of its gross weight dedicated to nothing but ammo. This thing had an ammo to weight ratio of 46.7%, which makes the ACH-47 Alpha less of a helicopter and more of a flying all-you-can-eat bullet buffet. Now sure, when compared to the AC-130, the B-1, and the B-52, they win hands down in sheer firepower and range by a huge margin. But pound for pound, the Guns of Go-Go is a literal ammo dump with rotors. That kind of hovering firepower on tap is what made the hype train very real with these birds. But in order to obtain this insane power to weight ratio, the Chinook had to go on a serious crash diet. Everything non-essential had to go, and in its place went guns and ammo. And when I say everything had to go, I'm being as literal as can be. If it didn't assist the gunners in sending rounds to the ground, it had to go. Cargo hook, gone. Winch, out of here. The heater, the cargo door, auxiliary loading ramp, soundproofing, anything, it all had to go. What they had created was the hovering embodiment of shoving a V8 into a British sports car. The greats like Carroll Shelby understood this on the ground, so why wouldn't it work in the sky? Only good things can come from Americans shoving big power into small things.
That's what she said.
And in order to achieve this level of mathematical mayhem, the Go-Go bird engineers went through their weapon inventory like a child circling every toy in a Christmas catalog. The team at Boeing loaded this bird with every weapon they could get their hands on, and the result is about as insane as you'd expect them to be. So as Flannel Daddy Grantham would say, let's go tip the butt on this big girl, starting with the M5 automatic 40mm grenade launcher. This bad boy was mounted under the nose, was controlled by the co-pilot, and came with 500 grenades for express delivery. Now while the co-pilot got to play with the 40, the pilot wasn't left out of the action either. If you're in a Guns of Go-Go, everyone was a trigger puller to include the pilot, where he had access to the pylon-mounted weapon systems. On each side of the Chinook were pylons loaded with an M24 20mm cannon with 800 rounds per gun. And they had their choice of either an XM762 Gatling gun with 1500 rounds per gun, or they could go the route of the XM159 rocket pods, each holding 19 2 3/4 inch folding fin rockets each. And to ensure the rockets would achieve the desired effect, these pods could be fired with up to 6 pairs at a time. That's already a ton of firepower on tap, but for good measure, it was decided to mount a couple of additional 50 cals, just in case. And by a couple, I mean 5, with 2 on each side and 1 on the ramp. And each 50 could carry up to 700 rounds per gun. But if the mission needed a little less punch and a more wide area freedom spreading capability, the 50s could be swapped out for M60s that could carry up to 3,000 rounds each. Now if all this sounds like overkill, then first of all, how dare you? Why don't you take your soft hands and you and your girlfriend's boyfriend can go complain on a sidewalk somewhere that isn't here? And second of all, let me remind you again what this helicopter was about to be up against. This low-flying large target was about to fly headfirst into gunfire. escorting other troop-carrying helicopters in order to protect them en route. And that was only half the job done, because when they would land in the assault areas, they would then have to lay down enough fire to make the enemy think about taking the day off instead of taking shots at our boys. But as much as it pains me to say, firepower alone wasn't gonna cut it. To survive flying straight into a literal firestorm, the Chinook was going to need armor and lots of it. The ACH-47 Alpha was fitted with 2,000 pounds of steel plating that got its own special treatment. The armor featured a hardened outer layer to shatter incoming bullets, and a softer inner layer to absorb any fragments that made it through. But even that wasn't going to be enough, because the steel itself received a special heat treatment to give it high strength but still be lightweight. Even the crew seats were heavily modified. These weren't just chairs, they were known as Iron Maidens. They were designed to provide 100% torso protection from every angle while still allowing freedom of movement. Essentially, the crew was sitting in a mini steel fortress within a larger flying fortress. Fully loaded, these angry birds could weigh up to 33,000 pounds, with over 15,000 pounds of which being pure ammo. That kind of hate on demand gave them about 2 hours of flight time before needing a refuel. Not that they needed much longer than that, because these birds made their presence felt as soon as they entered the fight. Their unique 360-degree field of fire let them break all the rules of traditionally used gunship tactics. These included breaking the cardinal rule of gunship tactics, which is to never overfly a target, because once you've done that, you'd lose your ability to suppress enemy fire. Or another way to think about it is that since your guns are facing forward of the aircraft, it's generally considered best practice to keep the enemy in front of you, since you can't shoot from the side or behind. But because the guns of Go-Go had all the weapons to include in the front, both sides, and the rear, the Go-Go bird didn't just break this rule, it wrote a whole new playbook. With over 1.5 tons of expendable munitions on board and dual-layered ammo, the ACH-47 Alpha was more than a helicopter. It was airborne carnage on demand, and the enemy knew it. Because when a Go-Go bird showed up,
gonna have a bad time.
When people think about helicopters in Vietnam, the Huey is the first thing that comes to mind, and why wouldn't it be? There were over 7,000 of them flying around doing everything from troop transport to medevac extractions. You also might think of the AH-1 Cobra, the first dedicated attack helicopter, and maybe even the 086 Loach, famously used in hunter-killer teams alongside the Cobras. But where does the Chinook fit into this conversation? Well, it rarely gets the credit that it deserves. But you know who did think highly of the Chinook? General John J. Tolson. Who? Oh, man, y'all are killing me. General John J. Tolson II. This wasn't just another name in military history. He helped to define helicopter warfare. As the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile in Vietnam, he turned the concept of air mobile warfare into battlefield dominance. Under his direct leadership, helicopters like the Huey and Chinook revolutionized troop deployment and combat mobility in ways the Army had never seen before. Hell, after the war, Tolson literally wrote the book on air mobile tactics. Which begs the question, what does a man of his caliber think of the Chinook? Well, in his own words, if the Huey helicopter became the cornerstone of air mobility, then the Chinook must be considered one of the principal building blocks. For Tolson, the Chinook wasn't just a helicopter, it was the logistical backbone that made air mobility possible. His vision just didn't win battles, it reshaped the future of the US Army to include the underappreciated ACH-47 Alpha. These flying fortresses excelled in landing zone preparation, road reconnaissance, and direct infantry support. With the ability to sustain prolonged fire, they were nothing short of a game changer, providing critical fire support that kept ground forces alive. The ACH-47 Alpha had it all. It had speed, it had endurance, and most of all, it had firepower. Firepower that made it the perfect escort for air mobile forces. Even at its max gross weight, it could still keep up with the CH-47 formations, which rarely hit their top speeds anyway. Its endurance even matched or exceeded the UH-1's fuel reserves, all while being armed to the teeth. With nearly 1.5 tons of ordnance on board, this bird could unleash sustained firepower in ways no other helicopter could match. Or another way to look at it is that this Go-Go bird could be as liberal as they wanted to when providing long strings of fire support, words that every soldier on ground wants to hear. Now, this wasn't just about throwing rounds downrange. The 47 Alpha introduced innovations that shaped all future gunships. You ever seen a forward cabin and rear ramp mounted machine gun setup? Those eventually became standard on CH-47 logistics models and are even carried over to more modern aircraft like the CH-53 Kilo King Stallion, for example. The 47 Alpha's 360-degree fire coverage meant aircrews could engage threats from any angle, rewriting the rules of helicopter combat. Having additional eyes all over the aircraft also meant that they could see where they were being fired from at all angles. And when you compare this to the AH-1 Golf Cobra, this was a huge win. Cobra pilots had so many blind spots that they often didn't even know they were under fire until they got hit. And when it came to engaging enemy troop concentrations, the Gogo's forward-firing 20mm cannon gave these helicopters a unique advantage in that they didn't have to wait or withdraw for tactical air support to arrive. They were the support. They could deliver precision strikes with 20mm accuracy or rain down area fire with 2 3/4-inch rockets. And let's not forget the M5 grenade launcher operated by the co-pilot, which added yet another layer of chaos to the mix. Basically, the Guns of Gogo could do the work of 3 UH-1s and do it for twice as long. So calling a pair of heavily armed and armored Chinooks a force to be reckoned with was a serious understatement. That said, the ACH-47 Alpha wasn't without its limitations. It was big, heavy, and not exactly the most agile bird in the sky. But what it lacked in maneuverability, it more than made up with sheer firepower and survivability. Its size didn't matter much when the enemy was too busy running for cover to take a shot. Even as the AH-1 Golf Cobra came onto the scene, the AH-47 Alpha filled a critical gap as the Cobra itself was only an interim gunship. The ill-fated AH-56 Cheyenne, which was supposed to be the ultimate gunship, was ultimately cancelled after prototype testing. I discussed this in greater detail in my Apache video where the Air Force effectively killed the Cheyenne project because they were too petty and felt like the Army was encroaching on their job that Dad gave them to do, but I digress, I'm getting off topic again. Go and watch that video next to see what all of that was about, but right now, we're talking about the Gogo bird. And in the ultimate testament to its effectiveness, Major General Tolson said this: "Though anything but graceful, it had a tremendous effect on the friendly troops which constantly asked for its support. From an infantryman's viewpoint, when the Gogo bird came, the enemy disappeared." Now that's high praise for any piece of equipment and their crew, but to me what's even more impressive is that the Army managed to field a piece of equipment that not only made the enemy run for cover, but also boosted the morale for troops on the ground. And if it could do all that, well, you know they did something right. Unfortunately, we've reached the part of the story where we have to talk about why only 4 of these magnificent flying death machines were ever made. And aside from the fact that the demand for cargo helicopters was at an all-time high during the Vietnam War, a combination of bad luck, technical mishaps, and logistical demands led to the untimely and unceremonious end to the ACH-47 Alpha program. Let's break this down bird by bird. It all started in June 1966 when Stump Jumper along with Easy Money and Birth Control were deployed to Vietnam. Spirits were high and everyone was eager to see what these hovering homicide helos could do. But on August 5th, 1966, disaster struck. When ground taxiing, Stump Jumper collided with, ironically enough, another parked Chinook and was completely destroyed. Yep, the first ACH-47 Alpha didn't go out in the blaze of glory. And to make matters worse, this mishap forced cost of living to cut its US testing short and to deploy to Vietnam to replace Stump Jumper. Not exactly the start everyone was hoping for. 9 months later, on August 5th, 1967, cost of living met its tragic end. While supporting troops near Bong Song, one of its M24 Alpha 20mm cannons suffered a catastrophic failure during a gun run. A forward mounting pin broke loose, causing the cannon to elevate and fire directly into the forward rotor system. The results were, as you could imagine, catastrophic. The rotor blades separated and the aircraft nosedived out of control. Cost of living crashed, and tragically, all crew members aboard lost their lives. With only 2 ACH-47 Alphas left, all remaining hope rested on their shoulders. 5 months later, February 22nd, 1968. Birth Control was part of the big push to recapture Hue during the Tet Offensive. While pulling up from a gun run, it took multiple hits from small arms fire, leading to a loss in transmission oil pressure. The crew managed to auto-rotate the helicopter into a dry rice paddy about 600 meters from the Citadel walls. Under intense enemy fire, they removed the guns and set up a defensive position, frantically firing until they could be rescued. Under intense and relentless fire, the last remaining Gogo bird, Easy Money, swooped in to save the day, positioning itself between Birth Control and the advancing enemy. While delivering suppressive fire, it successfully rescued all 8 Birth Control crew members, but not without taking several hits itself. Unfortunately, before an aircraft recovery mission could be launched, the North Vietnamese launched mortars that found their mark and completely destroyed Birth Control. And as birth control crew member Walt Lacey put it, she went out proud. On April 1st, 1968, the Guns A Go-Go program was officially terminated. The Army desperately needed transport Chinooks for logistical operations and decided to not allow a single ACH-47 Alpha to operate alone. Easy Money was retired and sent back to Vung Tau, where it served as a maintenance trainer at the Boeing facility until the withdrawal of US forces from Vietnam. Now, despite the legacy left behind by Easy Money, it took a number of years before anyone realized the historical significance of this bird. After years of abuse and undignified treatment, she was fully restored and now stands proudly as a museum exhibit at the United States Army Aviation and Missile Command at Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. Today, Easy Money serves as the sole survivor and a lasting tribute to the daring innovation of the Guns A Go-Go program, their airframes, and their crews. Now, while the Guns A Go-Go program may have been short-lived, and if we're being honest, most of the general population doesn't even know this bird existed, its residual impact was monumental, to say the least. It showcased the effectiveness of heavily armed helicopters in modern warfare and laid the groundwork for every attack helicopter that followed. The ACH-47 Alpha proved that sometimes brute force is the answer, and its legacy remains a testament to the ingenuity, bravery, and sheer audacity of its creators and crews. Here's to the Go-Go bird and the hate that she left in her wake. Guys, this video has been so much fun to research. Comment down below on what video you degenerates demand that I make next. Y'all take it easy. CT6 out.